Now that the Republicans were beat, the National Assembly in Frankfurt got to work, putting its own vision into action. They abolished the Federal Diet, and basically with it the German Confederation, since the Federal Diet was the only institution of the German Confederation. This was technically illegal, since the Federal Diet had created the National Assembly. And the National Assembly was really only there to debate the future constitution of Germany. But they were in charge now, so it didn't matter that it was illegal. The National Assembly also decided to create a second German Empire. Years ago, this was just a dream that didn't really mean anything, but now it was a reality. They had abolished the Confederation and turned it into an empire, illegally. But they had the power to do so. Well, an empire, which is a state, needs a government, so they created a provisional imperial government to take on the job of foreign policy and military policy and whatever else the National Assembly decided to assign it. To give these new imperial laws some kind of legitimacy, the Federal Diet, that still existed at this point, decided to approve them. They also wanted to give the whole thing some sense of legality, and they wanted to save face for the monarchs who had appointed them. And just like that, the German Confederation was gone, and in its place was the new German Empire. The creation of a German empire obviously alarmed the other great powers. They did not want a new German great power to suddenly spring up in the middle of Europe. They thought that this would probably bring war, as the 20th century would prove, but, well, you know. Now, an empire obviously needs an emperor. An empire without an emperor is not an actual empire. But really only two men would qualify for emperor. Either the Emperor of Austria or the King of Prussia, as those were the only two great powers within Germany. The obvious choice for emperor would be the Austrian one. After all, the Austrian Habsburgs had been emperors of the First Empire for the last 500 years, but an Austrian emperor would obviously not be acceptable to the Prussians. And also the current Emperor of Austria, Ferdinand, was a word that starts with re and ends with tard. And electing a mentally handicapped man to the highest office in the land was not exactly what a state who was trying to make a good first impression to its neighbors needed. The other option then would be to make the Prussian king the emperor of the new German Empire. But this would not be acceptable to the Austrians. They would not submit to a Prussian emperor. They would not view a Prussian emperor as legitimate. On top of that, the Prussian king, Frederick Wilhelm, was staunchly conservative, and it would take a lot for him to ever get a majority in the Revolutionary National Assembly of Frankfurt. Well, if you can't have an emperor, then appoint an imperial regent, And that's exactly what the National Assembly did. They appointed a guy called Archduke John to the position. He was some relative of the Austrian emperor. He was a member of the House of Habsburg. He hadn't really had any government experience or any government power before this, but he was almost universally popular, both among the people and also among the monarchs, because he was of the high nobility, and so they viewed him as one of them. So Archduke John makes his way to Frankfurt from Austria, and he's greeted with much fanfare. So the Federal Diet disassembled. There would be no more representation of the individual states on the imperial level. They handed over their buildings, the Federal Diet building, to the new imperial provisional government of Archduke John. Archduke John ran his new government, his new provisional imperial government, like a constitutional monarch, appointing members of the National Assembly to roles like Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and so on. The German Empire was now a new state in Europe. But what makes a state? States have three things to make themselves a state. For one, they have a populace. For another, they have a government. The German Empire now had both. But thirdly, they had a territory. And the new German Empire had inherited from the German Confederation no clear boundaries. For example, in the north, there was parts of Denmark, which were somehow also a part of Germany now. In the west, they had parts of the Netherlands, which were part of the German Confederation. In the east, they had Prussian territories, which were somehow not part of the German Confederation, even though Prussia was a part of it. And especially, the biggest territories were those of Austria. Most of Austria's territory was outside of the German Confederation and inhabited mostly by non-Germans. It would be impossible to ever include this territory in a German nation-state. But what were you going to do with it? Split Austria apart? They were a great power. Impossible. So, instead, two primary solutions evolved for the border problems of the new German Empire. The solution which most people initially favored was called the Greater Germany solution, and it called to simply keep the borders of the German Confederation. But this would create immense problems with the non-German territories of Prussia and Austria. They could not be included in this Greater Germany, but to exclude them would be to destroy these states, which they would never accept. So instead, a more practical solution was Lesser Germany, which called for the German states to unite with the exception of Austria, allowing the Austrian state to remain intact. Of course, Austria was still a German state and would therefore be united with the new German Empire through some kind of non-specific international agreement. However, this would obviously be very upsetting to the Austrians. They had been the leaders of Germany for like 1,000 years. The Austrian emperors had been emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, and Austria had been the presidential power of the German Confederation. But with this Lesser Germany plan, they were just to be excluded. The Austrian government called this Lesser Germany plan a crippling of Germany by cutting off one of its limbs. The question of the boundaries of the new German Empire was dividing the National Assembly. Previously, the National Assembly had been split into many different factions, but now it was beginning to only be split into two factions, those favoring a Greater Germany, which included many Austrians and Southern Germans, and those favoring Lesser Germany, which included many Prussians. But for the time, the Greater Germany faction would have the majority. Let us turn now to discuss one of these border problems, Denmark. Southern portions of Denmark were part of Germany, and in 1848 the old king of Denmark died, and he was replaced by revolution throughout his kingdom. To understand this revolution, we must look at some borders and treaties. These southern parts of Denmark were the three duchies of Holstein, Schleswig, and Lauenburg. Holstein and Lauenburg were part of the German Confederation, but Schleswig was not. As you can see, the borders are a real mess between them, and it didn't really matter that they were three separate states, part of Denmark during the age of absolutism, because all power had been centralized with the king. The dividing line that differentiated the rest of Denmark to those parts of Denmark which were part of the German Confederation was the Eider River. This legal border gore had some substance behind it, namely the Treaty of Ribe, which was at this point 400 years old and had been made between the old kings of Denmark and, which back then still existed, the First German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire of Germanation. The treaty basically said that the kings of Denmark could also be dukes of Schleswig and Holstein on certain conditions. One of these conditions being that Schleswig and Holstein must remain forever undivided. Within Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg, the majority of the population was German, but there was a substantial Danish minority in the north, and also in the west of Schleswig some people who called themselves the Schleswigers. These national differences hadn't really mattered back in the day when there were no parliaments, when there was no nation states, but now that the age of absolutism was over and the age of nationalism was beginning, these national differences would be a huge problem and could not possibly be reconciled with each other in a modern state. Concerning the problem of the nationalities, there were different solutions to this. The solution imagined by Danish liberals was that the two duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were to be separated, with Schleswig becoming fully incorporated into a modern Danish nation-state. The German majority of Schleswig would then simply become a German minority in the new Kingdom of Denmark and would be forced to assimilate. But the Danes realized that, of course, the Germans would have to be thrown a bone, and so the southern parts, Holstein and Lauenburg, which could never be assimilated into Denmark because they had no Danish population, would be allowed to become separate entities within the new German nation-state at some point in the future. This division of the two duchies, however, obviously violated the Treaty of Ribe. Since this Danish plan violated the Treaty of Ribe, the German opinion on the matter was that if the Danish king tried to put this plan into effect, he would lose his rights to both Holstein and Schleswig and Lauenburg, which would then legally become fully independent from Denmark and hopefully join a new German state. So, in 1848, when the Danish king died, German revolutionaries in Schleswig and Holstein and Lauenburg seized power over basically all of the duchies. The new Danish king decided to mobilize his army to march against his own people to stop them from becoming independent from him and joining Germany. The revolutionaries were scared, so they called for protection from the Danish army. The man who answered their call was a Prussian general called Wrangel. Wrangel marched his army up to Schleswig, defeating the Danish army and turning the German dreams of an independent Schleswig-Holstein into a reality, basically overnight. This freaked out the other great powers, especially Britain and Russia. They did not want Prussia to gain a foothold at the entrance of the Baltics. They viewed it as some sort of Prussian aggression against poor little Denmark. Of course, this was false. After all, it had been the people of Schleswig-Holstein who had called upon Wrangel to defend them against their own king, who had assembled an army to kill them. When the Prussian king heard of Britain and Russia's refusal to allow Wrangel to liberate Schleswig-Holstein, he asked his general to please retreat and leave Schleswig-Holstein. But Wrangel answered that he had come to Schleswig not at the order of the Prussian government, but at the order of Germany, and therefore the Prussian king had no authority to recall him. This was a Prussian general commanding Prussian troops, denying orders from the Prussian government. Such are the confusing circumstances which can be created by revolutionary times. The Russians and the British met with the new provisional government of Germany. And especially the Russians were pretty clear that unless the Germans evacuated their troops from Schleswig-Holstein, there would be war. The provisional government had no troops, and they had no money. They had no way to compete with these great powers, and so they decided that since it was Prussian troops, and Prussia was already known to the other great powers, the Prussians should handle this mess with Britain and France and Denmark. So, at the behest of the imperial government, the Prussian government met with the Danish government under the arbitration of the British government and with threats from the Russian government. They would agree to a treaty known as the Peace of Malmö, which basically gave the Danes everything they had wanted. You'd think that the news of peace, the end of war, would be celebrated by the German people. After all, what people want war, right? The German people called it treason, and they started an uprising in Frankfurt to get rid of this treaty and to restart the war with Denmark. The National Assembly was holding its meetings when suddenly they heard shouting from outside of people making their way to the assembly. The National Assembly was suddenly swarmed with angry protesters who were banging on the walls of the National Assembly, banging on the doors, trying to get in. It was a complete mess. The capital of the new revolutionary German Empire was suddenly itself overcome with revolution. As the crowds were going wild, Prussian and Austrian soldiers who had been stationed in Frankfurt showed up to try and calm the situation. As the crowds didn't calm down, they pulled out their rifles. And then they shot into the crowd of protesters, killing hundreds instantly and causing a mass panic. Elsewhere in Frankfurt, one of the deputies of the National Assembly who had been in favor of the peace was suddenly ambushed by angry protesters and murdered in the open street. It was a huge embarrassment for the National Assembly to have one of their members lynched by the people they were supposed to represent. Once the riots were over, the National Assembly decided to vote on the Treaty of Malmö. They rejected it. However, this rejection didn't really matter, as the three powers had already agreed to the Peace of Malmö, and so had the Provisional Imperial Government, leading Wrangel to leave Schleswig and Holstein, allowing the Danish army to march in and crush the revolution and retake the territory for the Danish king. And so the National Assembly voted on the Peace of Malmö again. This time they narrowly passed it, showing how powerless the National Assembly was suddenly becoming. So Prussia had been meddling in German affairs greatly, since it was a great power. But where on earth was Austria doing all of this? After all, they were the traditional leaders of Germany. The Austrians had been having significant problems. Hungary had risen up in a revolution. Italy, namely the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, had invaded Austria. And when the Austrian government decided to send troops to Hungary to crush the rebellion, their own capital, Vienna, rose up in a revolution to try to stop the soldiers from marching through. It looked like the Austrian Empire was breaking apart now that the age of nationalism had arrived. Many governments, like the British government, already began assuming that Austria would stop existing in the near future. During the revolution in Vienna, the Austrian Minister of War was literally seized upon by a crowd, murdered and hanged on a lamppost in the street. For a year now, the monarchs of Austria had been struggling to find a replacement for Metternich now that he was gone. But in the end of 1848, they finally found the proper replacement, a guy called Schwarzenberg. With the help of Schwarzenberg, the Russians agreed to invade Hungary and crush the Hungarian Revolution for the Austrians, allowing them to free up enough troops to fight off Italy. And just like that, in a matter of no time at all, Austria was suddenly restored to its original position as a great power. After having conquered, which is to say destroyed, their own capital, the Austrian government decided to execute hundreds of people who had taken part in the revolution. One of them was a deputy of the National Assembly called Robert Blum. It was technically illegal to arrest or especially execute without trial any member of the National Assembly, but the new Austrian government didn't care. They sentenced him to death in absentia. As Robert Blum was brought to the execution position, his last words were, "I die for liberty. May the fatherland remember me." The National Assembly in Frankfurt had not only once again lost one of its members, but they realized that they were losing the grip on Germany. They were losing the grip on the revolution. The revolution was running out of steam, and they were running out of time. Now that the winds were once again turning, monarchs all over Germany began dismissing their liberal ministers and replacing them with conservative ones. They were also beginning to tear up the liberal constitutions, which they had passed only at the beginning of this year. This de-liberalization of Germany was happening everywhere, as the revolution was beginning to grow tired.